The British Empire ruled a quarter of the Earth's landmass and population for 300 years. By 1945, it was bankrupt and begging for loans. What happened in those 4 years of World War II wasn't just military alliance. It was the greatest wealth transfer in modern history, executed through a program called Lend-Lease that turned Britain from global superpower into American debtor. The deal was simple on paper. America would lend Britain weapons, food, and supplies to fight Nazi Germany. Britain would pay after the war, but the terms buried in that agreement weren't about helping an ally. They were about dismantling an empire. By the time the war ended, Britain had surrendered military bases on 99-year leases, sold off assets across 3 continents, shipped its gold reserves to New York, and accepted loan conditions that forced the empire to liquidate itself piece by piece. This wasn't theft in the traditional sense. Everything was legal, negotiated, signed. But when one nation is days from invasion and the other controls the resources needed for survival, negotiation becomes extraction. The United States didn't conquer the British Empire with armies. It purchased the empire at fire sale prices while Britain fought for its life against Hitler. The transfer of global power from London to Washington happened in conference rooms and through financial agreements, not on battlefields. By 1945, the British pound, once the world's reserve currency, was finished. The dollar took its place. British military bases from the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean were American-controlled. British companies and assets worldwide had been sold to pay war debts. The empire that had survived Napoleon, World War I, and centuries of conflict couldn't survive being rescued by the United States. This is the story of how Lend-Lease worked as a mechanism of imperial transfer. How Britain entered World War II as a global superpower and emerged as a second-tier nation dependent on American loans. How every dollar of aid came with conditions that weakened British economic independence and strengthened American dominance. And how the war that saved Britain from Nazi occupation simultaneously ended British global supremacy. Understanding Lend-Lease matters because it showed how financial leverage during crisis can accomplish what military conquest cannot. The British Empire didn't fall to invasion or revolution. It fell to debt and dependency structured through wartime aid. And the precedent established between 1941 and 1945 created the template for American global influence that persists today. Britain entered World War I in 1914 as the world's dominant financial power. London was the center of global finance. The British pound was the reserve currency. The empire controlled shipping lanes, commodity production, and financial networks worldwide. Britain was the creditor nation. Other countries owed Britain money, not the other way around. World War I shattered that position. Fighting Germany required mobilizing resources on a scale Britain had never attempted. The cost was catastrophic. Britain spent over £40 billion on the war, more than its entire GDP. To fund the war effort, Britain borrowed heavily from the United States. By 1918, Britain owed America over $4 billion, a staggering sum that represented a fundamental shift in the global financial order. The war also forced Britain to liquidate assets. British investors held massive portfolios in American railroads, factories, and infrastructure. During WWII, Britain sold approximately $1 billion in American securities to raise cash. These sales transferred ownership of productive assets from British to American hands. The empire that had been lending money to the world for a century was now borrowing and selling to survive. Britain emerged from WWII victorious but weakened. The empire expanded territorially, acquiring former German and Ottoman colonies. But the financial foundation was cracked. Britain owed America billions. Interest payments consumed government revenue. The pound remained important but no longer dominated. New York was rising as a financial center to rival London. The empire looked intact on maps, but the economic reality had shifted. The 1920s and 1930s brought continued decline. The Great Depression hit Britain hard. Unemployment soared. The gold standard collapsed in 1931 when Britain abandoned it. A humiliating admission that the pound couldn't maintain its value. Imperial trade preferences tried to keep the empire economically integrated, but dominions like Canada and Australia were increasingly independent. By 1939, Britain was still a major power, but no longer the dominant global force it had been in 1914. Then came World War II. Germany invaded Poland in September 1939. Britain and France declared war. But Britain's financial situation was desperate from the start. The government knew it couldn't afford another total war. Rearmament had already strained budgets. Fighting Germany would require resources Britain didn't have and couldn't produce fast enough. Britain needed American supplies immediately: weapons, aircraft, ships, food, raw materials. But the Neutrality Act prevented the United States from selling arms to nations at war. President Roosevelt wanted to help Britain but faced legal constraints and political opposition from isolationists. The solution was cash and carry. Britain could buy American goods if it paid cash and transported them on British ships. This arrangement worked briefly but exposed Britain's vulnerability. By mid-1940, Britain was paying cash for every tank, plane, and bullet. Gold reserves were shipping to New York. Dollar reserves were depleting. British assets in America were being sold at distressed prices to raise cash. The empire was liquidating itself to buy weapons. In May 1940, Germany invaded France. Within weeks, France surrendered. Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. The military situation was desperate. The Luftwaffe was bombing British cities, U-boats were sinking supply ships, invasion seemed imminent. But the financial situation was equally catastrophic. Britain's gold and dollar reserves were nearly exhausted. The cash and carry policy was unsustainable. Without American supplies, Britain would lose the war. But Britain couldn't pay for those supplies. Prime Minister Winston Churchill sent urgent messages to President Roosevelt. The empire needed help. Without American aid, Britain would fall. The entire European continent would be under Nazi control. Roosevelt understood the strategic stakes but needed legal authority and political cover to provide aid. The solution was Lend-Lease. The Lend-Lease Act was introduced to Congress in January 1941 and signed into law March 11, 1941. The legislation authorized the president to lend or lease military equipment and supplies to any nation deemed vital to American security. The genius of the framing was that it avoided the loaded term give and implied eventual repayment without specifying terms. Britain would receive supplies and settle accounts after the war. The details would be negotiated later. To the American public, Lend-Lease was sold as helping Britain without getting dragged into war. Roosevelt compared it to lending a garden hose to a neighbor whose house is on fire. You help put out the fire, then the neighbor returns the hose. The metaphor was deliberately misleading. Weapons and ammunition aren't garden hoses. They're consumed in use. Britain couldn't return bombers and tanks destroyed fighting Germany. The entire premise that Lend-Lease was a temporary loan was fiction. But the British had no choice. The alternative to accepting Lend-Lease terms was losing the war. Churchill understood that America was offering survival at the price of empire. He took the deal because the alternative was Nazi occupation. The negotiations over Lend-Lease terms revealed the reality. This wasn't charity or alliance. It was a transaction where one party held all the leverage. The first Lend-Lease agreements included terms that would reshape the global order. Britain agreed to provide the United States with 99-year leases on military bases in Bermuda, Newfoundland, the Bahamas, Jamaica, Antigua, St. Lucia, Trinidad, and British Guiana. These weren't symbolic gestures. These were strategic locations controlling Atlantic shipping lanes and approaches to the Caribbean. Britain was handing over military control of imperial territories for nearly a century in exchange for destroyers and supplies needed immediately. The base agreements alone represented a massive transfer of strategic power. American forces would occupy British territory with rights that superseded British sovereignty. The leases were structured to be effectively permanent. 99 years meant these bases would remain American-controlled into the 21st century. Britain was ceding military control of its own empire to secure American aid, but the base leases were just the beginning. The Lend-Lease agreements also included Article 7, a seemingly technical clause that would prove more consequential than the military aid itself. Article 7 required Britain to eliminate imperial preference, the system of trade barriers that gave British companies and dominions favored access to empire markets. The United States demanded that Britain open the empire to American trade on equal terms. Imperial preference was fundamental to how the empire worked economically. British companies had protected access to markets in India, Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Dominions. This preferential access allowed British businesses to maintain economic dominance even as industrial competitors emerged. Eliminating imperial preference meant American companies could compete directly in markets that had been British-controlled for centuries. Churchill resisted Article 7. He understood it meant the end of the empire as an integrated economic bloc. But Roosevelt was adamant. American aid would come with the requirement that Britain dismantle trade barriers. The message was clear. If Britain wanted American weapons to fight Germany, the price was opening the empire to American economic penetration. Churchill eventually agreed because Britain had no alternative. The scale of Lend-Lease aid to Britain was enormous. From 1941 to 1945, Britain received over $31 billion in Lend-Lease supplies. This included aircraft, tanks, ships, vehicles, weapons, ammunition, food, raw materials, and industrial equipment. The aid was genuine and essential. Britain couldn't have continued fighting without it. But $31 billion in 1945 money represented an extraordinary debt, even under the fiction that it would be repaid after the war. Britain wasn't just receiving aid, it was also liquidating assets to pay for supplies not covered by Lend-Lease. British companies and investors owned valuable assets worldwide. Railroads in Argentina, mines in South Africa, plantations in Malaya, utilities across Latin America, industrial facilities throughout the empire. During the war, Britain sold these assets to raise cash. American investors bought them at prices depressed by wartime conditions. The liquidation of British overseas assets was one of the war's great hidden wealth transfers. Before the war, Britain held approximately $4 billion in foreign investments. By 1945, most of it was sold. American and other investors acquired productive assets at fractions of peacetime values. British companies that had operated in Argentina, Brazil, India, and elsewhere for generations were sold off. The empire's economic reach was being dismantled piece by piece. Britain also shipped its gold reserves to the United States. Approximately $2 billion in gold left Britain during the war years, much of it stored in vaults beneath the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. This gold represented Britain's financial backing, the reserves that supported the pound and provided economic security. Shipping it to America was an admission of dependence and vulnerability. By 1945, Britain was financially exhausted. The empire had mobilized total resources for 6 years of war. Production had shifted entirely to military needs. Cities were bombed, infrastructure was damaged, millions of soldiers needed demobilization. The civilian economy had to be rebuilt, and Britain owed staggering debts, not just Lend-Lease obligations, but also sterling debts to India, Egypt, and other empire territories that had provided resources during the war. The United States emerged from World War II in the opposite position. American industrial capacity had expanded enormously. The economy was booming. No American cities had been bombed. The dollar was backed by the world's largest gold reserves, including gold that had flowed in from Britain and other nations during the war. America was the creditor, the producer, the financial center. Britain was the debtor, the declining power, the dependent ally. In late 1945, Britain sent a delegation to Washington to negotiate post-war financial arrangements. The British needed a massive loan to rebuild and stabilize the economy. The empire was broke. Food was rationed more severely than during the war. Industrial production was depressed. The government faced potential bankruptcy. Britain asked for a grant or interest-free loan of $5 billion. The American response was brutal. The United States agreed to lend Britain $3.75 billion, less than requested, at 2% interest. The loan had to be repaid starting in 1951, with annual payments continuing for 50 years. But the conditions were even more punishing than the terms. Britain had to make the pound convertible to dollars within 1 year, eliminating exchange controls that protected British currency. Britain had to formally end imperial preference, opening empire markets to American competition. And Britain had to support the Bretton Woods system, which established the dollar, not the pound, as the world's reserve currency. The 1946 loan agreement was the final nail in the empire's coffin. Britain accepted because there was no alternative. The country needed dollars immediately to avoid economic collapse. But the terms guaranteed that Britain would remain economically subordinate to the United States for generations. The loan wasn't enough to rebuild properly, but was large enough to create permanent debt obligations. The convertibility requirement exposed the pound to market forces that would trigger recurring crises. The end of imperial preference dismantled the economic integration that had made the empire coherent. Britain made its final payment on the 1946 loan in 2006, 60 years after borrowing the money. Multiple generations of British taxpayers paid for World War II financing. The empire that had ruled the world borrowed money to survive and spent the rest of the 20th century repaying American creditors. The impact on the British Empire was immediate and catastrophic. India gained independence in 1947, ending British control of the empire's most valuable possession. Palestine, Burma, and Ceylon followed quickly. The African colonies would achieve independence throughout the 1950s and 1960s. The empire that had spanned the globe in 1939 was reduced to scattered remnants by 1970. The economic consequences were equally severe. British industry couldn't compete with American mass production. The pound faced repeated devaluation crises as markets tested Britain's ability to maintain convertibility. Sterling ceased to be a global reserve currency. The dollar took that role entirely. British companies lost access to protected empire markets and struggled against American competition. The economic dominance London had enjoyed for centuries was gone. The military dimension completed the transfer. American bases on former British territory became permanent features of global American presence. The Royal Navy, which had ruled the seas for 2 centuries, was superseded by American naval power. NATO placed American forces across Western Europe in bases that would remain for decades. The military infrastructure of global dominance shifted from British to American control. When the London gold pool closed in March 1968, there was no warning. Investors woke up and the market was locked. No gold available, no conversion. Done. We created the 7-stage collapse survival guide so you never get trapped when the window closes. It shows you exactly when to move your wealth into assets that survive collapse. Before banks freeze, before governments confiscate, before inflation devours your savings, while you can still act. The Bretton Woods Conference in July 1944 formalized the new financial order while the war was still being fought. The conference established the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, institutions dominated by American voting power and headquartered in Washington, not London. Most importantly, Bretton Woods made the dollar the world's reserve currency, with other currencies pegged to the dollar and the dollar convertible to gold at $35 per ounce. Britain attended Bretton Woods as a supplicant, not an equal. British negotiators tried to preserve some role for the pound and some independence for British monetary policy. They failed. The American position was uncompromising. The post-war financial system would be dollar-centered, and Britain would participate on terms dictated by American interests. The empire that had created the 19th century gold standard and made the pound the global currency had to accept a system where sterling was secondary to the dollar. The propaganda surrounding Lend-Lease always emphasized allied partnership and shared sacrifice. Roosevelt called it making America the arsenal of democracy. Churchill praised American generosity. The narrative was noble nations joining together to defeat fascism. That narrative was true in the sense that defeating Nazi Germany required cooperation, and Britain genuinely couldn't have won alone. But it was also a cover story that obscured the wealth transfer and power shift happening beneath the surface. The reality was that Britain fought Germany while simultaneously negotiating its own subordination to American interests. Every ton of supplies that arrived under Lend-Lease came with conditions that weakened British economic and political independence. The aid was real and necessary, but it wasn't charity. It was investment in a post-war order where America would be dominant and Britain would be dependent. American policymakers understood this clearly. They saw the war as an opportunity to dismantle British imperial trade barriers and establish American commercial dominance. Lend-Lease negotiations explicitly targeted imperial preference and sterling area arrangements. American diplomats pushed for access to British colonies and dominions. The goal wasn't just defeating Germany, it was reshaping the global economy to American advantage. British leaders understood it too, but had no leverage to resist. Churchill famously said he hadn't become prime minister to preside over the dissolution of the empire, but that's exactly what happened. The choice wasn't whether to preserve the empire, it was whether to fight Germany or surrender. Fighting required American aid. American aid required accepting terms that would end the empire. Churchill chose to fight and accepted the consequences. The human cost of this transfer is harder to measure but equally real. Millions of people across the empire saw their economic relationships change. Industries that had operated under British ownership for generations were sold to American buyers. Workers who had produced for protected British markets faced competition from American imports. The Dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, loosened ties with Britain and increased economic integration with the United States. The entire structure of global commerce shifted. The irony is that Britain's wartime sacrifice, fighting Germany for 2 years before America entered the war, enduring the Blitz, mobilizing total resources, was what made the empire vulnerable to American leverage. If Britain had negotiated peace with Germany in 1940, the empire might have survived in diminished form. But Britain chose to fight alone, which created the desperation that forced acceptance of Lend-Lease terms. Some historians argue Britain had no choice and that American aid, despite the conditions, was the best outcome available. This is probably true in the narrow sense that the alternative, German victory, would have been catastrophic. But it's also true that the United States used Britain's crisis to advance American interests in ways that permanently subordinated Britain and dismantled the empire. Both things can be true simultaneously. The legacy of Lend-Lease extends far beyond the 1940s. The pattern it established, providing aid during crisis in exchange for long-term economic and political concessions, became a template for American global influence. The IMF and World Bank, created at Bretton Woods, would use conditional lending to influence developing nations' policies. Military aid and security guarantees would come with requirements for base access and policy alignment. The Marshall Plan for European reconstruction would follow the Lend-Lease model of aid with conditions. The transfer of global financial power from London to New York was completed by the early 1970s when the United States ended dollar-gold convertibility and the Bretton Woods system collapsed. The pound had already ceased to be a significant reserve currency. London remained an important financial center, but New York and American institutions dominated global finance. The Bank of England had to defer to the Federal Reserve. Sterling crises happened when markets tested British economic policy, and Britain had to seek IMF loans, submitting to conditions imposed by institutions where America had veto power. By the 21st century, the wealth transfer was complete and irreversible. Assets that had been British-owned in 1939, companies, infrastructure, resources across the empire, were in American, multinational, or local hands. The naval bases that controlled strategic choke points were American-operated. The reserve currency that funded global trade was the dollar. The military alliances that structured security were American-led. The empire that had ruled a quarter of the earth became a mid-sized European nation dependent on American security guarantees and integrated into an American-dominated economic system. The story of Lend-Lease is often told as noble American assistance to a desperate ally. That's part of the truth, but the full truth is that World War II financial arrangements transferred global dominance from Britain to the United States through mechanisms that were legal, documented, and devastating. Britain fought Germany and won the war but lost the empire. America provided aid and won the peace by acquiring British power. The $31 billion in Lend-Lease aid wasn't a loan in any normal sense. It was the purchase price of the British Empire, paid in weapons and supplies while Britain fought for survival. By the time the war ended, the transaction was complete. America had bought global dominance and Britain had sold it, one loan agreement at a time, because the alternative was Nazi occupation. This is decoded economics. Subscribe to see the collapse before it happens.